everyone, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to the second video in my knitting series. And today I want to talk all about beginner knitting and how to get started knitting. So I do want to preface this video by saying that this is not going to be a tutorial on how to knit. There are so many videos on how to sort of grasp the technique of knitting and starting to knit that could explain things and demonstrate things way better than I can. So I'm also going to be approaching this video from the point of view of what I would tell someone else who wanted to learn how to knit, and perhaps what I wish I'd known at the beginning of my knitting journey. So I'm going to start by talking about the kind of tools that you might need if you want to start knitting. So I really believe that if you want to start knitting from scratch, the only things you really need are a pair of knitting needles and some yarn. I would suggest going for a double knitting yarn. Double knitting is kind of your mid-weight yarn, and it's really easy to handle and really easy to knit with, in my opinion. If you're going to be starting with double knitting yarn, then you can use a simple pair of 4mm needles. Essentially, when you're starting and practicing, other people might disagree with this, but I think it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not you're using the right needles for your yarn weight. You're not trying to achieve a tension here, you're just trying to get the technique of knitting down. You can get these sort of shorter needles. So these are, I don't know if they're actually children's needles or whether they're just shorter, but when I was a child I learnt to knit on some shorter needles like this, and you can pick these up from any yarn store, and I know that they have these in our local John Lewis. So these are more your sort of standard knitting needle length, and this is what you'd need to use if you were knitting a garment, because you'd need to have quite a lot of stitches on your knitting needle. But if you're just starting, you're going to be knitting a little sample rather than a garment of any kind, then short needles like this are much easier to handle, and therefore much easier to just sort of get your head around the kind of techniques and things and the way that you need to knit. A few other things that you might want to have, which are useful but I would say not necessarily even essential, are a knitting bag or a project bag of some kind. So this is just a drawstring bag. This is actually my own pattern, and I will have a tutorial for this coming out soon. I'm working on it. But any bag will do essentially. It could be a Tesco carrier bag or a fabric bag or anything that you have already to hand that you can just put in all of your knitting supplies and keep everything together, so that when you come to do your knitting you've got everything you need in one place. Another thing you might need is a tape measure. Tape measures are obviously really useful for measuring the length of knitting that you've already done, but also as you get further into your knitting you might need a tape measure for measuring tension, swatches and things like that. Another thing you might want to get, which I don't actually have to hand, is a stitch stopper. So a stitch stopper is something that you just pop on the end of your needles when you're finished knitting for the day or for however long you've been knitting, and you want to pop it on the end of your needles just so that you don't end up putting your knitting away and having all of the stitches fall off of the needles. So they can be really helpful, particularly when you're starting knitting and you sometimes forget to sort of push the stitches down to the end of your needles when you are finished for the day, and then they end up accidentally falling off. Another thing you might want to have to hand is a notebook. So you can make this a little bit smaller than mine, but having a little notebook or somewhere that you can just write things down can be really helpful, particularly if you are sort of moving on to following a pattern. It can be really handy for just making notes and remembering where you are, but also as you're learning, if there are little bits and pieces and things that you want to remember, maybe you want to remember even how many stitches you've cast on, then just writing everything down in a notebook or even on your phone, of course, can be really helpful. So once you've sort of mastered the basic techniques and you're thinking of moving on to patterns, then you might want to pick up a set of needles in different sizes. It can be really helpful to have a set of all different kinds of needle sizes, because different patterns require different sizes of needles. And depending on your preference, you could pick these up in either straight or circular needle form. Lots of knitting patterns do require different sizes of needles, and when you get more into knitting garments then you will want different sizes for different parts of those garments. For example, the ribbing on a sweater will use a smaller needle than the body of your garment, so you do need to switch between various different sizes when you are knitting certain patterns. But before you get on to knitting any kind of project that requires any kind of knitting skill, then it's always really handy to master the basic stitches. So in my humble opinion, there are about 6 things that you want to master before you move on to knitting any kind of garment. And you can do this just by practicing with your random needles and your random yarn. So the first thing, of course, that you need to master is how to cast on stitches to your needle. You will also want to master a knit or a garter stitch, a purl stitch. You'll also want to master a basic increase. So increasing is when you'll be adding stitches to your needles to create shape. So if you're knitting bottom up, for example, adding stitches will give you this sort of upward V shape. And just to give you an example of how that might be used, if you're knitting a sleeve from the bottom up, then you will knit a certain amount and then you'll be increasing as you go, just to give yourself more space as you come towards your underarm. Another technique that you'll really need to master is decreasing stitches. So in decreasing stitches, you will be losing stitches from your needle to create shape in the opposite direction. So if you're decreasing stitches from your needle, you're going to be going that way and just getting smaller and smaller rather than getting bigger and bigger. And then the last technique you'll want to master is a basic cast off stitch. So there are loads of different ways that you can cast on and cast off, and you'll probably want to sort of determine which one you find the most easiest. So you're probably thinking, that's all very well, but how do we learn these techniques? So I'm going to share a few YouTubers that have really helped me. So I'm coming at this a little bit more advanced, I guess. So when I learned to knit, there was no YouTube around, unfortunately, and I couldn't just bring up a video to show me how to do a technique, but I still use these channels now. If ever there's a technique in a pattern that I'm not sure about, then I will go over to these channels and just see if they have any tutorials over on their website, and these channels are brilliant. So the first one, and the channel that I most often recommend to beginners, is Very Pink Knits. She has over 800 videos on her channel, and I've yet to find a video that she doesn't actually have. So for learning basic techniques such as casting on, knit stitch, purl stitch, increasing, decreasing and casting off, she has a video for all of those things, and I will link her channel in the video description below. I find her teaching technique in the way that she films really clear and really easy to follow. So if you are wanting to start from the beginning and just master those basic techniques, then pop over to her channel and have a look at some of her videos. Another channel that I really love and do reference quite frequently is the Blue Mouse Knits. So similar to Very Pink Knits, she does have a fair few videos on lots of basic knitting techniques. So again, if you are wanting to learn from the beginning, she has a whole beginner series on these basic stitches. I think really it's about finding the channel or the filming style or the teaching technique that you most prefer and that you get on with best. But both of those channels, I would say, if you're wanting to learn, head over to them, have a look at their beginner series, and you're good to go really. You can start by following one of those videos with your short knitting needles and your scrap of yarn. Sheep and Stitch is another really great channel with loads and loads of knitting tutorials, and also RJ Knits too. They're both really thorough, really good knitting channels that have videos for a variety of different beginner techniques. So I just wanted to talk briefly here about the difference between straight needles and circular needles, because I had loads of questions when I asked over on Instagram and on YouTube for knitting questions about the difference between straight needles and circular needles. So with straight needle knitting, you will have 2 separate needles with ends essentially. With the circular needle, you will have your 2 ends joined in the middle with a wire. It's possible to knit flats on both a circular needle and straight needles. So I grew up and I learned to knit on straight needles, and I knit on straight needles for years and years. And when I came to wanted to sort of transition or learn how to knit on a circular needle, the whole process seemed extremely scary. Now, I can promise you, based on experience, that it really isn't as scary as you think it's going to be. If your aim is to eventually knit on a circular needle, so if you want to learn how to knit top down, if you want to learn how to knit sweaters in the round, And if you want to sort of knit all of these lovely Scandi patterns that you see over on Instagram and on Ravelry, I would say if you're a complete beginner, start on a circular needle, because even though I would say it's not as difficult as I thought it would be to transfer from straight needles to a circular needle, it did still feel a little bit weird at first, and I still had to get my head around the fact that I was holding 2 needles on one wire, or like one needle essentially, compared to when I used to hold 2 and knit in that way. So you can knit flat with a circular needle, and rather than sort of joining your stitches in the round, you will just knit back and forth in the same way using these 2 needles on this wire as you would if you were knitting flat. I think this is a great way to knit actually. So even if you're someone that doesn't necessarily like to knit in the round and have your stitches joined, it's so much more helpful having your knitting on a longer wire like this, because you can so much more clearly see how big your project is, and it's much more easy to sort of hold your knitting up against you and see if you think that the sizing is right. It's also much more portable to knit on a circular needle like this, even back and forth, because it's so much easier to just shove a circular needle into your bag with your knitting than it is to try and sort of put in your straight needles that are going to stick out everywhere. So if you're someone that likes to take your knitting out and about with you, then again, that is another argument for learning on a circular needle. So knitting in the round, again, really is not as scary as you think it's going to be. The only difference really with this sort of method of knitting is that when you start off, you need to make sure first of all that you don't twist your stitches, and then with every row you need to mark the beginning of the row so that you know where you're stopping and finishing with each row, because it's not as easy to tell obviously as when you're knitting flat. You know when you've come to the end of the row. I find the more I've practiced knitting in the round, the easier and quicker I find it to be, because so if you're knitting a stocking stitch jumper top down on a circular needle, you literally only need to knit a garter stitch or a knit stitch and circle around and around in your knit stitch, and that will by magic produce a stocking stitch. So there's no purling involved. I think a lot of knitters, me included, do find purling a little bit slower than knitting. Let me know if you are already a knitter if you find that as well, but I do find constant knit stitch much faster and quicker to do than purling back on a row. And knitting top down as well, again, it's really easy to try on your garment as you go, which is always a bonus too. I think the only downside I found with circular knitting is that you do need to buy or have available different lengths of circular needle depending on which part of the garment you're knitting. So you'll start off in the round very small, so if you're knitting like a collar or a neckband or something, and then as you're knitting and increasing either to sort of accommodate for a yoke around your shoulders or raglan increases, your knitting is growing, so you're sort of getting more and more stitches on your needle, and you then need to transition onto a bigger wire. Be able to accommodate all of your stitches and make sure that you're not sort of pulling your stitches around too large a circular needle. All of this will become more clear the more you do it. I have to mention this because I know if I don't, someone else will mention it. You can knit with a method called the magic loop, which does help you to avoid having to buy all these different lengths of circular needles, but that's something for another day, I think. So let's move on to a few simple beginner projects then, which I think would be great for someone who's just starting out, so a complete beginner. And I will list a few patterns to go along with these suggestions in the video description below as well. So with these projects, I'm going to assume that you've already mastered the stitches that I've already mentioned, so the knit, the purl, the casting on and off, and the increasing and the decreasing. So if you've mastered all those things and you're feeling as though you want to knit an actual thing now, then the first thing I always recommend to complete beginners that you could try and knit is a scarf. And the reason I recommend a scarf is because essentially a scarf can just be what you want it to be. So a scarf can just be casting on an amount of stitches and knitting as far as you want to go. I would suggest probably in garter stitch because stocking stitch can curl up a little bit at the edges. But just knitting back and forward, practicing the technique, making sure you don't drop any of your stitches, getting the feel of the yarn in your hands and the needles in your hands, and just knitting and knitting on something easy can be a really great way to sort of practice your beginner skills. And you can knit that scarf as long or short, as long or as short as you want it to be. And you can also practice things like changing colour. So if you want to introduce a new colour to your scarf, you can practice sort of knitting in new colours. It's also a great way to use up scraps. So if there's anyone around you that knits and wants to pass on all of their scraps to you, then making a basic stripy scarf or scrappy scarf can be a really good project for a beginner. Another thing you could do is make a blanket, and a blanket is a really good thing to make because you can practice knitting lots of different squares in lots of different stitches. So for example, you could have a garter stitch square, and you just need to cast on a certain amount of stitches, knit to a certain length, and then cast off again, and that would be your square done. And then when you've done enough squares, you can just sew or crochet those squares together. And again, a great way to use up scrap yarn too. So when you do feel ready to move on to a garment, then something I always recommend for people to try and knit is a really easy beanie hat. And this is the Rowan Sally hat pattern. It's super simple pattern, and for me, having a bit more experience, I can actually knit this now in a couple of hours. But for a beginner, it's great because it's knit in chunky yarn, so it knits up super quickly. Chunky yarn can be really nice and easy to handle for beginners on big needles. And it just involves a knit and purl 1 by 1 rib at the bottom, garter stitch with some decreasing to create the shape of the crown. And it's a really good way to sort of practice those different techniques and stitches that eventually you will be using when you come to sort of start creating actual garments that you can wear. Obviously you can wear a hat, but you know what I mean. So I'll list this pattern in the video description. It's a really, really good one for beginners, I think. I also found this full video tutorial for a beanie hat from Good Housekeeping over on YouTube, and I thought this was great too because it comes with all of the instructions and a full-on YouTube video to follow throughout. So I will link that in the video description too. So once you've mastered a hat, you've mastered a blanket and possibly even a scarf, you might then be ready to tackle your first garment. So one of the first things I would recommend starting as a complete beginner or someone that's sort of making their first garment is a really simple cardigan. So I love to recommend, again, it's a Rowan pattern, but I do think Rowan are very good for beginners. This Rowan brush fleece knitting book is a really, really great place to start as a beginner, I think. All of these projects are actually knit flat. And one of the patterns I think is great for beginners, and I will pop an image of this on the screen as well, is the latte cardigan, which is from this book. So this is a really lovely cardigan. I have a version of this cardigan which I'll pop on screen now, but it's probably my most worn cardigan. It's probably one of the easiest things I've ever knit as well. It's all knit in stocking stitch and there's no rib at the bottom or even on the sleeves. There is the ribbing all around the edge of the cardigan, but don't worry about that for now. I really do think that this is a very easy project and I find it a good one to recommend to beginners. Not only that, it's knit with chunky yarn, so again it does knit up very quickly. If you're wanting to start with a cardigan that's knit top down, if you want to go straight in and start with your top down knitting, then I'd highly recommend the petite knit novice cardigan. I do think petite knit patterns are really good for beginners, and this is actually the first cardigan that I knit when I was learning to knit top down. So obviously at that point I did have quite a lot of knitting experience, but I hadn't actually knit top down, so it was new to me. The pattern was really well written and there are quite a few video tutorials over on her site as well. So this is a really good one to start with, I think. When I was coming to research for this video, because I don't feel like I have a huge amount of patterns to recommend to you from personal experience, I did have a look over on Etsy and found that they had loads of beginner knitting patterns over there. So I did find this super chunky garter stitch cardigan on Etsy, which I thought would be great for beginners, and it looks really trendy actually as well. It looks like something that I would really like to wear. This one, as far as I can tell, not having read the pattern, looks as though it's also constructed just from rectangles. This one out of the three that I'm recommending is probably the most easy pattern to start with. In terms of sweaters, again, I would recommend Rowan, and actually I'm going to come back to this book again. This sweater on the front of the book here is a really easy beginner knitting pattern. This one is knit flat, so again it depends on your preference and how you want to learn, but if you are someone that thinks they would prefer to knit something flat and then seam up, this would be a really great pattern to start with. There's also another Rowan pattern that I love, and I knit this a few years ago. This is the Rowan Ludham sweater. Again, a really simple style knitted sweater, just knit in rectangles with a little bit of picking up and ribbing to do around the neckline. Again, a chunky yarn knit, so something that will come together quite quickly and easily. Back to petite knit, and again, petite knit has a pattern for a novice sweater. So it's knit in a really similar way to the cardigan, but this one is actually knit in the round. Again, this was the first pattern that I tried when I started knitting in the round, and I found it really easy to follow. And again, there are YouTube tutorials over on her website if you do get a little bit stuck. Again, I would highly recommend looking at Etsy for beginner knitting patterns. There are loads of easy sweater patterns over there, as well as cardigans too. There are also sites full of knitting patterns. If you fancy having a good search and really falling down a rabbit hole of lots of beginner pattern inspiration, you can have a look on Etsy, as I've already recommended. Hobbycraft, Knitting Network and Love Crafts are full of patterns, and also Ravelry as well. How could I forget Ravelry? So on all of those sites you can search beginner knitting patterns and they will bring up lots of different patterns that you can try. So let's move on to different yarn types, shall we? Because this can be a little bit overwhelming, can't it? There are so many different yarn types out there now, and I'm just going to list a few of the most sort of common yarns that I think you'll find on the high street and online as well. So first of all, let's start with acrylic yarns. So these are probably the most commonly available, I would say, and you can pick up acrylic yarns in shops like Aldi, Lidl, Home Bargains, Pound Stretcher, even Tesco supermarkets now will stock some acrylic yarns. Acrylic yarns are really easy to knit with. They're great for beginners because they're really nice and easy to handle. They also most often, I think, will wash in the washing machine too, so you don't have to hand wash them. And they're a really good yarn to practice with as a beginner, I would say, because they're often the most affordable kind of yarns. You can also get either pure or blended forms of wool, merino or alpaca, and they will be your sort of softer and more fibrous yarns, I think. There are also cottons and cotton blends. I would say cotton is a really nice yarn to knit with most often, and cottons are really natural and breathable. So if you're not someone that likes to wear acrylic fabrics, then perhaps start off by going down the cotton route, because cotton is a really lovely smooth yarn. It's easy to knit with. It feels really nice when you're holding it and knitting with it, I think. Light cottons are really great for summertime, but you can get heavier cottons as well that are more suitable for sort of autumn, winter time and will produce a more heavier fabric. Someone did ask me over on Instagram about holding two strands of yarn together. So this is actually something that I've recently got into. Holding two yarns together, I think, anyway, as a bit of a novice in this area, can serve two purposes. So you can use two different yarns to be able to produce a certain weight of yarn. So for example, if your pattern calls for something like a DK weight, you could substitute with a 4-ply and a lace weight, for example, to build that yarn combination up to a DK weight, and therefore being able to achieve your knitting tension. Another reason why you might want to hold two strands of yarn together is because you want to make your yarn more cozy and more fluffy. So for me, I've really enjoyed holding two combinations of yarn together recently. One would be a 4-ply weight and one would be a mohairy lace weight, something that's a little bit fluffy. And holding those two yarns together and knitting just produces a really nice fluffy texture. And it's a really good way of sort of getting a more lightweight, cozy garment rather than having to use something that's more chunky. So a really good way to remember different yarns and the type of fabric that they produce is wool will be sort of stretchy and forgiving. Cotton and linen will be quite stable and quite structured depending on the weight of the cotton that you're using. Acrylic is your sort of budget, easy care type yarn, readily available and really easy to work with and wash. If you want something really luxurious and soft, then maybe go for an alpaca or a merino. And if you want something that's nice and balanced, then you want to look for blends of your favourite yarns. Yarn brands that I really love. I absolutely love Drops yarns. I find them really affordable and they do a really wide range of different types of yarn as well. Another brand, I've mentioned them many times already, is Rowan. Again, their wool is always really lovely, but they are on the more expensive side, I would say. If you're wanting something more budget, if you're perhaps starting out and you don't want to be spending too much money, then Stylecraft yarns are great. They can often offer acrylic yarns, but they really do feel that little bit more soft than some acrylic yarns can sometimes feel. So I would highly recommend Stylecraft. They can be bought, I think, in Hobbycraft and John Lewis and places like that. So I just thought I would mention some beginner frustrations. So when you're starting out as a beginner, much like when you're starting out as a beginner in sewing or any other craft that you might be trying to attempt, sizing can be a big sort of frustration, and it can be quite difficult to get the sizing right when you're knitting, because often it's easier when you're knitting in the round, but often it can be quite difficult to determine the size of your finished knitted garment until you've actually finished it and blocked it and tried it on properly. But I would say one thing that you really need to do, especially when you're starting to knit garments, is make sure that you create your tension swatch. So just to briefly cover tension swatching. So when you are knitting a garment, it's really important that you make sure that you're knitting to the gauge that that designer has designed that pattern for. Am I saying that right? I think I am. So the designer will have sized their garments, assuming that your knitting measures a certain amount widthways and lengthways. So in most knitting patterns, hopefully all patterns, they will include a tension swatch that you need to knit before you even think about casting on the garment. It can be really tempting to miss this stage because it's just another thing that you have to do before you start knitting your garment. But this can be one of the most important things that you do in order to be able to get your sizing right. Another frustration, and something I very much found at the beginning of my knitting journey, was that things felt too homemade. And I would say that one thing that's helped me massively in this area is learning to knit top down and learning to knit in the round, because there is so much less seaming up to do. And I felt like seaming up was always the thing that kind of let me down in my knitting and was what made my own knitted garments look more homemade. Blocking your knitting is another thing that really sort of elevates your knitted garments, I think, and makes them look more professional. So I haven't at all covered blocking in this video. So when you're blocking something, you can block in various different ways. My preferred sort of blocking method, if my yarn allows, is to soak block something. So to completely immerse it in water, leave it for around 10 minutes, wring it out, and then pin it flat to the size that you want your garment to be when it's finished and when you want to wear it. Leave it to dry, and then most often, particularly when you're knitting lace, when you're at that point, blocking in this way will just absolutely transform your knitted garment. It will give it drape, it will give it softness, it will open out your lace, it will resolve sometimes bumpy stitching issues. It really is like magic. I do have a couple of reels and short form videos on how I block my knitted garments, and I'll link those in the video description as well, just in case they're helpful. Another frustration might be understanding knitting pattern jargon. So I know for me, when I first started out looking at knitting patterns, they just look like another language, really, don't they? And it really does take time and experience to get your head around how knitting patterns are written. And it just comes with sort of experience. And the more you knit, the more you learn. So lots of knitting patterns will actually abbreviate the techniques. So you'll find things like K for knit, or P for purl, or K2 tog if you want to decrease in the form of knitting 2 stitches together. It's just about sort of learning and getting to know those stitches and the way that they're abbreviated and the way that knitting patterns are written. And it doesn't take long before you do get the hang of it and you realise how things are being written. And if there is ever an abbreviation that you don't understand, then Google is often your friend in that situation, or even YouTube as well. And my final frustration is that things take such a long time sometimes when you're knitting. I know there are some Speedy Gonzaleses out there on Instagram. I know I follow a few that I'm absolutely in awe of, that churn out these knitted garments so quickly. But for me, my knitting isn't like that. It takes me often a good few months to finish a garment, and I'm okay with that because I like the slow process of knitting. But having said that, it can be frustrating sometimes if you plan to knit yourself a lovely spring cardigan and you know that it's going to take you a couple of months, for example, to actually knit and sort of finish that knitted garment, because you're always having to plan in advance your knits in order to have enough time to wear them or to be able to get them made for whatever it is that you want to wear them for. So I really hope today's video has been helpful. I feel like I have talked a lot and I really hope that the information I've shared has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to pop back and watch the first video in this series if you have missed it or if you haven't watched it already. There will be 2 more videos coming out in this knitting series. I'm going to have a video sharing everything that I still own that I've knitted and talking through the patterns and how I found them. And I'll also be sharing some spring knitting plans with you too, which I'm really excited about. So make sure you're subscribed to my channel so that you don't miss out on those future videos. If you have enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. You can also follow me over on Instagram at Made by Sally Gauntlet, and I have Patreon too for more sewing and knitting inspiration. Take care everyone, happy knitting and happy sewing, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.